Hi everybody, welcome. This is Mark Davis and I'm here at St. Mark Presbyterian Church, and you are watching the first of our Lenten text studies for 2025. So today is Monday, March 3rd, and on Wednesday, March 5th, we will have a discussion here at St. Mark in the Bonhoeffer room where we will discuss the presentation and the text that I'm presenting today. And we will show that on Zoom if you would like to join us that way. And we will record that Zoom video and put it on our YouTube channel if you have to watch it later. Also on Wednesday at 6:30, we're having an Ash Wednesday service here at St. Mark. And I think you would really enjoy being there. So I'd like to see you on Wednesday morning, as well as Wednesday evening. During this season of Lent, we're doing something a little bit differently than we've done before with our friends at a very good ministry called A Sanctified Art. We are following this theme called Everything in Between. And the point of the theme is to meet God in the extremes. We feel like we're living in a very polarized world, very polarized nation to be sure. And we have this tendency to name everything in terms of binary oppositions that cannot abide. And what we want to do throughout this season of Lent is to begin to read these biblical stories and to begin to look at our discipleship journey as what it means to live in between those extremes. So instead of being binary extremes, they become polarities, and we live in between them. So week after week, we're going to look at the biblical text and consider our discipleship journey with respect to what it means to be between one thing and another. And I think today you'll have a very, very good example of how that's going to work. So what we're doing throughout this season, however, is we're following what's called the narrative lectionary, as opposed to the Revised Common Lectionary that we typically follow here at St. Mark. The narrative lectionary readings between now and Easter are all in the Gospel of Luke, and many of them you'll find familiar. And so that's what we're going to be doing throughout this season. If you are accustomed to following the Revised Common Lectionary, just be aware that these texts will be different. So as you can see, we're going to start with the story, basically the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan today. And we're framing that story as in between stranger and neighbor. Stranger and neighbor, we typically see those as oppositions, and we're going to explore this text as what it means to be in between the stranger and the neighbor. And then we'll follow other texts with same kinds of polarities in mind. You can see the text listed here, and if you're with us for our in-person discussion on Wednesday, you'll have a hard copy of the text as well. So today we are going to look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's found in Luke chapter 10. We're going to cover verses 25 through 37. And again, in everything in between, stranger and neighbor. This story, this reading, actually has three parts. So we're going to treat it that way. And the first part is where a lawyer tests Jesus with a question. It's a long text, and I'm not going to read it right now. So if you want to stop and read the text now, I would encourage you to stop the video, get out your Bible, and read chapter 10, verses 25 through 37 to get the whole text. I'm going to break it up into three parts because I think there are three different movements in this text. And in the first part, verses 25 to 28, a lawyer stands up and asks Jesus a question. Okay? So, first of all, as a lawyer, I don't want you to think Perry Mason or, Matlock or something like that. It's not that kind of a lawyer. This would be someone who specializes in the Mosaic law, a religious leader, a religious expert, as it were. And so that's the conversation here between two Jews, both of whom follow the Mosaic law. This is not a Jewish-Christian dialogue. Jesus is a Jew. And he's talking to someone who's on his team, as it were. So this lawyer asks him a question, but Luke says very specifically that it's a test. It's a test. It's the same word that Luke uses in the temptation stories. So, it's a test. And he asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? So I want to pick up on two words in the question there. What must I do, first of all? That's a good translation. It could mean something like to perform, to accomplish, what needs to be done in my life, to inherit. That's an interesting term. That would be the expectation of someone who stands in line to inherit something, not someone on the outside trying to get in, right? So what must I do to inherit eternal life? I don't think he's asking, how do I know I'll go to heaven when I die? I think it's more like this is the kind of question that scholars of the Mosaic Law would ask one another a lot. This is probably the rabbinical question that any disciple would ask a master. And a genuine disciple could ask this of Jesus. How should I live? What's the chief end of humanity? What's the purpose for which we're created? Now, it's the kind of question that a disciple would ask a master. But remember, Luke has told us that this lawyer is not really intending to be a disciple. He's testing Jesus. There are occasions in Matthew and Mark where people ask this question genuinely. But here, it's a test. And I love the way Jesus answers the question. So he's talking to a student of the law, an expert on the law of Moses. So he asks, what's written in the law? And then he asks the follow-up question. This is interesting. How do you read it? So not only what's written, but how do you read it? To me, that's a frank recognition that you might have the written law, but you also have the interpretive process that goes into the written law. So yes, what's written, how do you read it? And the answer is, the man gives a very, very satisfactory answer. He begins by citing Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. You've heard me mention this before. This is that part of the book of Deuteronomy that begins with the word, hear, O Israel. Hear, listen. And the Hebrew word for listen or to hear is Shema. So you'll often hear this phrase, this verse, referred to as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You will love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. That's from Deuteronomy 6:5. It takes on different forms. Sometimes it has 3 parts, sometimes it has 4 parts. But it's what a faithful Jew would say every morning upon rising, because this is the call. This is the chief end of what it means to be faithful, to love God with all that we have. But the lawyer doesn't stop there. He also adds a verse from Leviticus 19. And you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. So here at St. Mark, we looked at that 3-part great command, it's often called, from a different gospel for a while. And we looked at them together. And this really is the 3 parts of what it means to live a life that is pleasing to God. It's a very, very good answer. And Jesus simply looks at this lawyer and says, do this, and you will live. If this had been a genuine question, the lawyer would have thanked Jesus and followed Jesus perhaps, or at least gone on to his life to love God with all of his heart, mind, and soul, and love his neighbor as himself. But remember, this is the test. So the lawyer asked a second question. And this one also Luke identifies as being something of not a loaded question, but also not a genuine one. Because Luke says, in order to justify himself, he asked, and who is my neighbor? And I can almost guarantee you that when biblical scholars got together in that day and they talked about, what the command is that God calls us to do, and they mentioned loving God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and they added to that wisely Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. I would imagine the first real question that came up for explanation and interpretation is, so who is the neighbor we're talking about here? So again, the first question and the second question in themselves are genuine questions that any disciple might ask a rabbi within that tradition. But the first question was asked as a test. The second question is asked as a way to justify himself. I don't know from whom or before whom he is trying to justify himself. But again, it's not a genuine inquiry. There's something behind that question. And he asks, who is my neighbor? And it's in response to that question, that second non-genuine test question, that Jesus gives the parable that we know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? So within that context, you've got this parable. There's a certain man traveling from Jerusalem into Jericho. He fell among robbers. He was stripped, beaten, and left half dead. Okay, so that's the context here. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho is about 17 miles long. It drops over 3,000 feet in elevation. So when you see references often to going up to Jerusalem, it's not that Jerusalem is north on the map. It's that you've got this elevation to get up to where the city of Jerusalem is. And if you go from Jerusalem to Jericho, you're going down a pretty sharp decline there. It's about 17 miles, fairly common route for travelers to take, and would be a common route for, say, some Levites or priests who can't really afford to live in Jerusalem, or perhaps whose duties take them outside of Jerusalem. But of course they have to travel to and fro, because you go to Jerusalem for high holy days, for festivals, and to do one's duties periodically in the temple. So it's not an unusual thing that you might have travelers on this road. It's not an unusual thing that you might have priests or Levites traveling this road. And so this unfortunate person is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, is beaten by robbers, left for dead. And then others come by. And we have three characters. First, you have a priest that walks by. It could be a priest who's serving a synagogue in Galilee. It could be a Jerusalem-based priest going out to do something elsewhere. You have a priest that passed by, and when the priest sees this victim lying on the side of the road, specifically Jesus says, he crosses over to the other side. That's real powerful imagery, I think. Then you have a Levite that comes by. So back in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, when Jacob has 12 sons, one of them is named Levi. And at the end of his life, when Jacob's name had been changed to Israel, and he's blessing the 12 sons of Israel and establishing the tribes and giving them inheritances, Levi's blessing is that he will be the progenitor of a tribe whose job it is to keep the temple, to keep the tabernacle, to keep the law, to keep the scrolls, all those kinds of things. So a Levite would be in the employ, as it were, of the temple or the synagogue, the tabernacle, whatever manifestation of religious site they have at the time. And I don't know, by Jesus' time, we're talking hundreds of years later here, whether these are all actual descendants of Levi or if that just became what a temple worker would be called as a Levite. Not sure. But we associate the title Levite with someone connected to the piety of the people and ensuring that the structure for the piety is available. So this church worker, as it were, is also passing and sees the person left on the side of the road, again, passes on the other side. So 2 down, 1 to go. The next one to come by is a Samaritan. A Samaritan. Now, geographically, Galilee, where Jesus spends a good bit of his ministry, is in the northern part of greater Israel, and Judea, where Jerusalem is in the southern part, and in between the two, in biblical times, is the area called Samaria. And so if you're passing from Galilee to Jerusalem, like Jesus is in the final part of his ministry in the Synoptic Gospels, it's easiest to pass through Samaria. And you might remember that in chapter 9, the previous chapter to our story, Jesus wanted to pass through Samaria, and the Samaritans would not welcome him because he had his face set on going to Jerusalem. That's a text that we're going to read on Ash Wednesday. And I just want you to be aware for our sake that when Jesus is telling this parable, it's the chapter after he was rejected by Samaritans. So in the end, this Samaritan is going to be the hero of the story, but an unlikely hero, not only ethnically among their people and culturally, but also given how Luke's gospel is unfolding. So let's look at this Samaritan, okay? He did not pass on the other side. He was moved with pity. This is a word that I love. I don't know quite how to pronounce it correctly. Something like splagnitzomai, and it seems to be a very visceral term. Sometimes it's translated as compassion, but it's more of a gut feeling term than a heart feeling. It's not a sweet feeling by any means. It's a wrenching feeling. It could almost be anger in some cases, but even more than that, just extreme, aghast pity. And that's what this Samaritan feels when he sees this unfortunate person on the side of the road. He is moved with pity. That's a pretty good translation. It could even be stronger language, I think. And instead of passing on the other side of the road, he went to him. So that's a difference right there. And then he does something interesting. He pours in the oil and wine and bandages the wounds. Obviously, with wine, you've got some alcoholic content of some sort that might be using for cleansing. Oil also has a medicinal purpose to it. And that's important because throughout the Old Testament, you often hear the trilogy of bread, wine, and oil. Or you might hear about wheat fields and grapevines and olive trees. These are signs of prosperity. They're signs of abundance. And even the 104th Psalm speaks about God giving bread to strengthen the human body and wine to gladden the human heart and oil to make the face shine. So the oil has a cosmetic purpose, but it also has a health purpose. And you can see that here in this story. So when you read in the Old Testament that, for example, if someone's harvesting their olives, they're not supposed to shake the branches and get every single olive, but leave some of them for people who don't have land, that's an argument that even people who aren't landowners, who are poor, have a right to health care, just like they have a right to mirth, because you can't pick all your grapes. You have to leave some of them for the landless. Just like they have a right to eat, because you can't harvest your fields all the way to the edges. You have to leave it for those that don't have fields. So what I like about this story is that it shows us that at least one of the purposes of oil and wine is medicinal. And that's happening in this story. That's how he cares for him. This is triage here. First aid, as it were. And then he puts him on his animal, which is interesting that he changes position. And now he's grounded. The other person's riding on the animal. He brought him to an inn, and don't miss the detail that when he got him to the inn, he took care of him. There's not a hospital here. One usually got cared for by one's family, and we don't have any idea whether this guy's got family around. So he takes him to an inn, takes care of him, and then when he has to move on, he pays the innkeeper and promises to come back and basically starts a tab for him. Anything that's needed to continue ministering to his needs, he will pay when he returns. Look, this is super abundance when it comes to helping a neighbor, right? Or helping a stranger. So that's the story that Jesus tells in response to the question, who is my neighbor? And so after the parable, we've got the third part of our reading. And this is when Jesus comes back to his conversation with the lawyer. And remember, in the first question, Jesus said, what does the law say and how do you read it? In this story, he says, how did you hear the story? Who in this story was the neighbor? He asked. So we go from the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, to the question, who was being a neighbor. We go from the answer after the first question about what the law says. Jesus says, do this and you will live. When the lawyer answers, the one who offered help was the neighbor. Jesus says to him, go and do likewise. In the first question, it's all about what the law of Moses says. And with the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's all about what the law of mercy says. So we've got a great parable here. I want to add one little detail, and that is that when back in 1959, Martin Luther King Jr. went to walk on this road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he saw with his eyes what it was like, and said in a way that I think is rather sympathetic with the Levite and the priest. You know, it was probably dangerous to stop and help somebody on a road like that, if it was known for being a road that had robbers and thieves. So it's kind of an interesting way of leaning in and saying, you know, in this story, there's not a clear bad guy. There is a very clear neighbor. But the reasons for not being a neighbor might be grounded in fear rather than hard-heartedness. And I want you to hold that and think about that. And that's something we can discuss Wednesday when we get together. So this Wednesday, 10 a.m., right here in our Bonhoeffer room, I look forward to seeing you. And I will send out an email shortly with the link to this video, as well as a handout for Wednesday's class and all the Zoom information. Okay? See you then. Thanks. Bye.